Good morning. Come on. We're in the home stretch. All right, let's try again. Good morning. All right, good. Okay. My name is Chris Birdie, and welcome to IADC Talks, Witnesses to History. This morning, before we begin, I do want to say something about our speakers. Each one of them, rather than putting together a traditional panel, we solicited volunteers from the ranks of the IADC. And so we came up with these 5 speakers, and each one of them has volunteered their time and energy to put together and share with you a very personal story about an important event throughout history. And so I just want to recognize the fact that these speakers are a little bit different than a traditional panel form that you have seen throughout the week. And so I just want to recognize that, particularly because some of the stories you're going to hear this morning may be a little interesting, certainly interesting, but are very personal to each individual speaker. So I want to recognize that. All right, so this morning we are going to spend the next few minutes talking about history and how to define history. And so in preparing for the talks this morning, I came up with, or tried to come up with my own list of definitions, and I looked at really 3 sources for how to answer the question of what is history. And the first place I looked was to the dictionary, and I came up with a pretty lame response of a plain vanilla answer that you might expect to find from a dictionary. So I moved on to the next source, and I thought, well, what have the great politicians and statesmen of our time and times past had to say about history? And not surprisingly, I came up a little short there too. So I moved on to the final source on my list in answering that question of what is history. And I looked to some of the great thinkers and writers of our time and times past, and that is where I found what I think is the appropriate definition, at least for this morning's talks. And Shakespeare said it best: there is a history in all men's lives. There is a history in all men's lives. At some point throughout our lives, each one of us has asked or been asked the question, where were you when? Where were you when? Where were you when? And so I want to ask each one of you in the audience this morning that same question as you listen to our 5 speakers. Where were you when? Where were you when Katrina made landfall in New Orleans? Where were you when the Chinese Cultural Revolution came to an end? Where were you when the Berlin Wall came down? Where were you when President Bush announced Desert Storm? Where were you when you first learned about the atrocities of racism? Our speakers this morning have pretty different answers to those questions, certainly different than most of us have in the audience. They will say, I was in New Orleans when Katrina hit. I was in China when the Cultural Revolution ended. I was in Berlin when the wall fell. I had been deployed to Iraq when President Bush announced Desert Storm. I was drinking from an all-whites water fountain in Vicksburg, Mississippi when I learned about racism. There is a history in all men's lives. Sometimes history takes the shape of a single, isolated, unique event, like a natural disaster. This morning's first speaker, father, husband, Saints fan, past IADC president, Quentin Urquhart, is going to share with us the horror of living through Hurricane Katrina and the rebirth of the city of his ancestors. So join me in welcoming Quentin Urquhart to the stage, please.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. My name is Quentin Urquhart, and I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1959. Before Hurricane Katrina approached our city, I had never had a reason to evacuate the city. My family had never had a reason to evacuate the city. But on August 28th of 2005, my family found itself, like thousands of other New Orleanians, leaving our city ahead of Hurricane Katrina. Now, as we inched our way out of the city, most of us were tuned into WWL radio and a man named Garland Robinette. Garland's an interesting guy. He was born in Cajun country. He flunked out of LSU. That's hard to do, by the way. Ended up serving in Vietnam, earned 2 Purple Hearts, came back and became a preeminent TV and radio broadcaster in our city. And on this day, Garland was called in to cover for a friend. And when he went into work that day, he noticed something unusual that brought him back to Vietnam. He walked outside. There were no birds in the trees, no squirrels scurrying around, not a stray cat anywhere. Garland remembered that in Vietnam, before a firefight, everything got quiet. When he arrived into the studio that day, he didn't mince any words. He told the people, "I don't know what the powers that be are telling you, but I'm telling you right now, panic, get out, go, go, go. The animals are all gone." And go we did. We know what happened over the succeeding days and weeks. Hurricane Katrina was the largest hurricane and the 3rd strongest ever to strike the mainland of the United States. Over 1 million people were displaced. 15 million people were ultimately impacted by Hurricane Katrina. It flooded 80% of the city of New Orleans. It caused over $81 billion in direct property damage, over $150 billion in economic impact, making it the single costliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. Now, more than the economic impact, the human toll was incredible. Because of a late order by our mayor, people were stuck in the city after the storm. They couldn't get out. Over 70% of the housing stock in the city was adversely impacted. It was either flooded or completely destroyed. This is a photograph I took a month after Hurricane Katrina in the lower Ninth Ward. People couldn't get out of the city, and they began to suffer. Over 1,800 people died from Hurricane Katrina. 705 people are still missing from Hurricane Katrina. So now, as we approach the 10-year anniversary of this storm, it's appropriate for us to step back and ask ourselves, why did this happen? And what are we doing in the future to prevent the single largest catastrophic natural disaster in the history of the United States from occurring again? So to answer that question, we need to go backwards. A Tulane professor recently wrote a book called The Accidental City, all about New Orleans. And the title is appropriate. New Orleans was formed, or at least its origins date back to the 1600s. Back then, the land that New Orleans sits on was owned by the French. The British had a monopoly on tobacco. The French wanted to establish a colony to grow tobacco, and they picked Louisiana. Not a good location because tobacco doesn't grow in a swamp. Into this, a small village was formed on the banks of the Mississippi River. Indian tribes were all around it. It was infested with snakes. Swamps surrounded the city. Pestilence was everywhere. But yet the city persisted. It held on. Into this stepped Bienville. Bienville formed the city and convinced the French government that this was the place they needed to put their principal location in the United States. Now, New Orleans did have some strategic significance. It's located on the banks of the Mississippi River, in the delta of the river, but it was also only about 7 miles south of Lake Pontchartrain. And there was an old Indian portage route that led from the city north to Lake Pontchartrain. Now, many of you here may or may not know something about Lake Pontchartrain. Lake Pontchartrain is the 2nd largest lake in the United States other than the Great Lakes. It's 52 miles long by 26 miles wide, and as we will see, this lake plays a huge role in Hurricane Katrina. Now, by the 1800s, the city had expanded. We had built along what we call the sliver along the river. But as the population increased, we needed more room. we needed to move north towards the lake. The problem was that area was nothing but cypress swamp. Into that, we built some of the world's largest pumping stations. These stations still exist, and we drained the land. So that by the 1950s, New Orleans had filled out all the way from the river, all the way north to Lake Pontchartrain. The original old portage route is there in red, and there are the blue canals, you can't see them as well on this slide, heading towards the north. To the east, we had constructed a canal to lead from the Mississippi River to Lake Pontchartrain to the north, and then a new waterway called the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet to the east. This was built by the Corps of Engineers to give quicker access to the Gulf of Mexico. The problem was the Corps never maintained it. And like an open wound, the Mr. Go kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the time of Hurricane Katrina, it plays a critical role in what happens. A quick word about levees versus floodwalls. To be clear, the levees on the Mississippi River never failed during Hurricane Katrina. What failed were floodwalls. Floodwalls located along these canals that drained the city. Now, New Orleans sits underneath sea level. If you're in the city, you feel like it's table flat, but it's actually a gigantic bowl. And if you walk from the Mississippi River to Lake Pontchartrain, a distance of about 7 miles, you actually go down and you come back up again. We have no natural drainage in our city. The water table sits about 4 to 5 feet below ground, so we have to pump every drop of rainwater out of our city. So why weren't we ready? We knew the city had been built on a swamp. We knew we were underneath sea level. We knew that hurricanes had hit our city in the past, some as recently as the 1960s. Hurricane Betsy in 1965, Hurricane Camille in 1969. These are photographs of Hurricane Betsy from 1965, showing the horrible damage. And this last one is of the lower Ninth Ward. Lower Ninth Ward completely flooded in 1965, yet people moved back. In 1969, Hurricane Camille hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast following a route almost identical to Hurricane Katrina. It wiped out the Mississippi Gulf Coast entirely. Why didn't we learn from that? As they say, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Over the succeeding years after Hurricane Camille, a number of major storms came into the Gulf. Alicia, Andrew, Opal, Ivan, and Hurricane Dennis earlier in 2005. None of them made a major impact on the New Orleans area. We began to believe, falsely, that somehow we had a zone of protection near the Gulf and near the mouth of the Mississippi River that protected us and sent the storms to the left and sent the storms to the right. Of course, there was no scientific basis for this belief. What there was a scientific basis for, though, was what was happening to our wetlands south of the city. The Corps of Engineers had channelized the entire river, so the river no longer overflows its banks every spring, replenishing the wetlands. In 1839, we had a lot of wetlands south of New Orleans. By 2005, much of it was gone. And that wetland serves as a buffer against storms as they come on shore. So, Katrina, 2005, the most active hurricane season in the history of the Atlantic Basin. Over 30 tropical depressions, over 15 major hurricanes. Katrina starts in late August as a tropical depression, and it moves across South Florida. At this point, if you look at the projected track, it was headed back up towards the Florida Panhandle. Now, where were the Urquharts on Thursday? Where were we? Well, this is Duke University. We were putting my oldest daughter into college. Katrina wasn't on our radar screen. We were worried about our child. Nor, though, was it on the radar screen of the city of New Orleans. This is the Friday morning paper. Look at the headlines. Anything about Katrina? Anything about a concern that a major storm is approaching our city? Nothing. The only mention of Hurricane Katrina on Friday morning was in page A10, and that was about it crossing the panhandle of Florida. However, by late Friday, we began to get concerned because the track was now being shifted to the west. By Saturday morning, the track was now projected to come straight over the city of New Orleans, and people began to get out. Now, we don't have a lot of good exit routes from our city because we're surrounded by water, so the roads became clogged very quickly. By Sunday morning, Hurricane Katrina had developed into a full Category 5 storm, and the Urquharts decided it was time to get out. Now, I put this up here for humor, but it's got a point, which is that we only thought we were going to be gone for 4 to 5 days. We threw everything in the back of my oldest daughter's 4Runner. We put the 2 dogs into kennels. We stuck my younger daughter, Elizabeth, in the back seat with them. And we took off to Memphis, Tennessee, a route that should have taken 6 hours. It took 13 and a half hours that day to get to Memphis. So, those that didn't leave the city were stuck, and they had to go into the Superdome, which was opened up as a shelter of last resort. Katrina hit on Monday morning, August 29th, as a Category 3 storm, not a Category 5 anymore. And as you can see by this, it moved very quickly to the east of our city, about 30 miles east of our city. By noon, it was really out of the area. It came in about 6 a.m., 6 hours later, it was gone. Now, watching all this up in Memphis, we felt pretty good about this because hurricanes, as some of you may be aware, their worst quadrant is the northeast quadrant. And we weren't in that quadrant, so we felt pretty good. The hurricane, though, when it did come through the New Orleans area, caused tremendous amounts of damage, even though it was only a Category 3 storm. Low-lying areas flooded. Trees were knocked down on Canal Street, but look at this picture of Canal Street, because I'm going to show you another one in a few minutes. There's water in the streets, but it's not flooded. This is more wind damage that's going on. This photograph, though, is probably one of the most ominous ones. This was what was moving up the Mississippi River Gulf outlet that morning that no one expected. A storm surge of unprecedented proportions was moving up that channel towards our city. And this is how Mother Nature took back her ground. This is a map showing the storm surge associated with Hurricane Katrina and the route of it. The yellow is 12 to 14 feet above normal. The red is 22 feet above normal. Water was being pushed in massive quantities into Lake Pontchartrain and up the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. To give you an idea of the power of that water, this is Interstate 10 on the eastern part of the lake. Huge sections of roadway lifted up and just dropped. As that water was pushed into the city, it funneled in through the Mississippi River Gulf outlet and into the industrial canal. Those canal walls were overtopped, and 2 neighborhoods on either side of the canal immediately flooded, including the lower 9th Ward. This is a photograph showing you the overtopping of the industrial canal. Later that same day, water began to come into Lake Pontchartrain in huge quantities. And it backed up into those canals that are normally designed to push water out of the city. Suddenly, water was coming in. The walls of those canals burst, and the city began to fill. This is showing you where the 17th Street Canal burst. This break alone probably flooded 60% of the city of New Orleans right here. So, over the succeeding days, the city filled like a gigantic bathtub. This is Canal Street 2 days after the storm. It's now flooded. And this again is an aerial view of the lower 9th Ward about 3 to 4 days after the storm. 5 days post-storm. This is the flooded area of New Orleans. About this time, we equalized with Lake Pontchartrain. Water was no longer coming into the city. It was coming out of the city a little bit here. Now remember that map from 1878. And what areas of the city were occupied in the sliver by the river. If you superimpose what flooded during Hurricane Katrina, the really heavy areas of flooding, it's almost a block-for-block match. People in 1878 knew where to build. We ignored that later. We thought we could defeat Mother Nature. Now, rebuilding our city. Before I move on to that, I need to say thank you. I need to say thank you to all of the people who took in the people who had to leave New Orleans. We lost 260,000 people over the 3 to 4 months following Hurricane Katrina. Everyone, Dallas, Atlanta, Houston, Memphis, the Pensacola Gulf Coast, northern Mississippi, took in our people, and people from all over the country. So thank you to each and every one of you. To start rebuilding our city, we had to fix the two fundamental problems. First, that flow up the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. We've now constructed a huge wall. This was the single largest public works project by the Corps of Engineers, I think since the Hoover Dam, they said. This huge wall, in theory, is supposed to block the flow of water. It hasn't been tested yet, but it's there now. We also had to address those drainage canals, and we've now put gates at the mouth of every drainage canal, so if a hurricane's coming, we can close those gates and water will not back up into them again. Again, it hasn't been tested, but we hope it works. But then on a more personal level, we had to rebuild. We were fortunate our home was in that sliver along the river. While we sustained very significant water damage, wind damage to our home, we didn't flood. Those homes that did flood had one of two paths. Either tear down the home completely, which is these homes in the lower 9th Ward. Again, these are more photos that I took. These homes had to be completely razed. No way to save any of them. But this is more typical of what most people in New Orleans faced. A home that was structurally sound, but yet had had water in it for 1 to 2 weeks. Everything melts inside your house when water sits in it for 1 to 2 weeks. And you've got to rebuild it from the inside out, and it's a difficult, time-consuming task. And this is when I thank people again. We had this great outpouring from around the country of people coming in to help us rebuild. So thank you to each and every one of you who helped in that effort. So probably the most significant rebuilding job was the Superdome. It was significantly damaged in the storm and the flooding that occurred thereafter. We were about to actually lose our NFL franchise, the Saints. But by September of 2006, a little over a year after the storm, the Dome was back. And on a Monday night, we hosted the Atlanta Falcons and reopened the Dome. Early in that game, the Saints blocked a punt and scored a touchdown. And you look at the crowd, you can see we're back. The city is back. Four years later, we won the Super Bowl. So, to finish up, please come see us. We are back. Everything you loved about our city is there. The culture, the music, Mardi Gras, Jazz Fest. Our food, interesting fact. Before Hurricane Katrina, we had 800 restaurants in our city. We now have 100,000 less population. We have 1,200. Come and eat. Now, our city before Hurricane Katrina, to wrap up here, we were considered an economic backwater, a poor educational system. Look what's happened over the past 3 years. These are all headlines. Our city still has issues, still has problems, but we are better, we are back, and I want everyone to come and visit us because we're about to celebrate 300 years for an accidental city that made an improbable recovery. Thank you very much.